Hi, everybody. Dr. William Davis here. Why do I call this bagel brain? Well, a number of reasons. Consumption of modern wheat and closely related grains have a whole multitude of effects on the human brain, undesirable effects. So let's talk about them. You can group the effects that wheat and grains have on the brain into reversible causes, that is, temporary causes that go away after you stop consuming them. And then there are either poorly reversible or partially reversible or even irreversible changes in the brain, diseases of the brain that you cannot undo or only can partially undo. Let's talk about the reversible changes. The reversible changes in the brain are due mostly to the gliadin protein and gliadin-derived opioid peptides. Recall that wheat and grains are the seeds of grasses, and humans simply lack the enzymatic machinery to break down the components of seeds of grasses. That means many of the proteins are either indigestible, like wheat germ agglutinin, completely impervious to human digestion, or only partially digestible, like the gliadin protein within gluten. So gliadin is broken down to 4 or 5 amino acid long peptides, pieces. Unlike, say, the proteins in a pork chop, steak, hamburger, egg, those proteins are broken down to single amino acids for absorption. Well, when you eat the gliadin protein of wheat and related proteins in other grains, like the secalin in rye, hordein in barley, the zein in corn, you break them down into pieces, not to amino acids. Well, these 4 or 5 amino acid long peptides are able to cross into the brain through the so-called blood-brain barrier and bind to the opioid receptors in the human brain. Well, what does that do? Well, in people who have paranoid schizophrenia, it causes paranoia, worsens paranoia, and causes them to hear voices, auditory hallucinations. In children with ADHD or autistic spectrum disorder, it triggers behavioral outbursts and it abbreviates their attention span. In people who are prone to depression, it causes depression. In people who are prone to bipolar illness, it can trigger the manic phase. In people who are prone to bulimia or binge eating disorder, it can trigger 24-hour-a-day food obsessions. How about you and me who might not have those conditions? It only triggers appetite. So people who consume grains are prompted to consume around 400 to 800 more calories per person per day, though sometimes it can be much more, like 1,500 calories per day. So in other words, gliadin-derived opioid peptides from the partial digestion of wheat and related grains are appetite stimulants. That's why people who consume grains will pile their plates high with food and then go back for seconds to go to the all-you-can-eat buffet, back and forth, because they can't get enough. These are the people who eat a big plate of pasta. They're so full, their stomach hurts, but they're still hungry. That all goes away, by the way, when we're wheat and grain-free. So those are the reversible changes, largely due to the gliadin-derived opioid peptides. Now, there's also a collection of irreversible or only partially reversible changes, such as cerebellar ataxia. That's a condition where the cerebellum in the back of the brain that controls functions like bladder control, bowel control, and balance atrophies. It kind of degrades and it gets damaged and it atrophies. On an MRI or a CAT scan, you'll see that the cerebellum is shrunken. And this results in people losing balance. They fall, they stumble very readily. They lose control of their bladder and bowels. And then they eventually, within a few years, die. That's a disease of wheat and grain consumption. It is only partially reversible because the brain, autoimmune conditions of the brain are difficult to turn around, and the brain's not very good at healing. But typically what happens is someone who identifies this as cerebellar ataxia from the gliadin protein of wheat and related grains, you stop wheat and grains, and it typically stops getting worse, and you can get partial remission. I have seen cases of complete remission, but most commonly it's partial remission. So the key with cerebellar ataxia is to identify as early as possible. Seizures can be caused by wheat and grains. The most common form of seizure is what's called temporal lobe seizures. And you can often see a collection of calcium in the temporal lobe by a CAT scan or an MRI. It's more common in teenagers. When you stop wheat and grains, in this case, you can reverse it. It may take some weeks to months, but those seizures typically stop. It can less commonly wheat and grain consumption can less commonly cause grand mal seizures also. I have seen a handful of cases where grand mal seizures miraculously stop with a halting consumption of wheat and grains. Lastly, dementia. Wheat and grains contribute to dementia in a variety of ways. The two most important ways is something called gluten encephalopathy. This is an autoimmune process that's rapidly fatal. So the onset of memory impairment, dementia, to death is on average 2 years. It's a very rapid, aggressive form of dementia. That's gluten encephalopathy. A much more common form of dementia is triggered by the high blood sugars and the body-wide inflammation triggered by the inflammatory components in grains. So the high blood glucose, for instance, causes glycation. That is glucose modification of proteins that is irreversible. So the various proteins in the brain become glycated. When proteins become glycated, they become ineffective. They become essentially debris. And it causes debris accumulation in the brain. Also, you get insulin resistance in the brain. That's why you hear people call dementia type 3 diabetes. So wheat and grain consumption raises blood sugar, raises insulin, and over time generates insulin resistance. You grow visceral fat, a wheat belly, and the increasing insulin resistance, the glycation, all contribute to dementia. And those issues are largely irreversible. So once again, the key, just like cerebellar ataxia, is to go wheat and grain free as early as possible in life so these irreversible changes don't occur. Bottom line, wheat and grains, contrary to popular opinion and conventional dietary advice, are awful for your health. And in this case, they damage your brain. They have transient or reversible effects, and they have irreversible effects. Key is don't eat bagels, waffles, pancakes, unless you recreate them using some of the wheat belly type recipes and safe replacement ingredients like almond flour, ground golden flaxseed, coconut flour, and natural non-caloric sweeteners.